Okay, hello everyone. Um, Today we're gonna ask these folks what they think of the moon. But before we do that, we're gonna go visit some of Velikovsky's work. I was just talking about the Tale of Two Suns. Coming over here, I mentioned before Velikovsky pointed out there was a time before the Earth had a moon. And these would have been the really early ages. One of the suspects I have here, I'm not making this up, Velikovsky mentions Uranus, specifically here, in a time that precedes the age of Saturn. So, I don't know if any of you are fully aware Saturn may have been our original sun, um, according to a few theories that are out there. Seems to be some evidence that supports it, but right here they talk about a time referring back to a Greek myth that talks about Saturn castrates Uranus, and that's like their way of describing it. Like when Saturn gets dethroned, he gets castrated by Jupiter. That's, but at the same time, if you think of it like coming back over here, like if we would have stole this moon from, I mean, castration may be one way of putting it, and here he says it's a way of describing like emasculation or whatever. But it now this is really interesting because according to this is Velikovsky's words. Now he's saying the removal of Uranus by Saturn gave birth to Aphrodite, and worlds in collision, Aphrodite was identified with the moon. And normally, from what I find, Aphrodite appears to be referred to with Venus, but I don't think that would be an error that Velikovsky would make here to go back and refer this specifically with the moon. And they talk about, in Greek mythology, this is like 2 ages prior to Jupiter and Jupiter's arrival. So, I mean, this is interesting, but when you come out and look at the solar system, if there was a time that Saturn crashed into the solar system, if you figure all these objects in relatively the same place, minus these 4 inner planets, maybe even this asteroid belt, but if Saturn were to have collided into the solar system, it would have had to get by this and this before it even got to Jupiter. So maybe there was a close encounter with one of these two that may have brought us our moon. Because like when you look over at the map, this is where I was over here. We'll talk about this in a second. But this definitely looks like it came from the moon and caused a lot of devastation. But when you look at the tales, now I'm going to go back one. This is the Velikovsky archives. I was just reading some of this to give myself an idea where it came from. I guess he formulated a lot of this in the 1940s, actually. But it never got published. This is before Worlds in Collision. Right here, this is all the stuff that came before Worlds in Collision. And Worlds in Collision, he describes, I'm going to take you up here so I don't have to say it for him and he can speak for himself. He's saying that this is like, so coming down here, he's talking about the order in which things came. And he was in Worlds in Collision. Certain things that he described there came at a later time than what he was describing here. Is some of the stuff that refers back to Saturn and the flood, Jupiter and the thunderbolts. And he basically said that all the commotion from Worlds in Collision, he didn't publish this stuff. So, but looking over at this is all the stuff that happens like before the flood. And I was looking at some of the deification of the planets and some of the other things. But he talks about this. This is, I kind of found this fascinating because he referred in one of the other tales, he talks about how Moses dies on Mount Sinai. I might have to talk more about that when we get into the 7 days. But he's saying Mount Sinai owes its name to Sin. Babylonian moon god was Sin. So when you come over here, this is why I was asking these guys. This is actually kind of fascinating. While I'm here, I'm just going to point this out because if this is to the north, see, Saturn was to the north, so if they were watching this from here and looking to the north, this would have been pretty cool. So this might have been carved here for a reason in remembrance to what was taking place. If you could imagine Saturn at a mountaintop up here. But this would have been before that even happened, if we're talking about the moon. But just hearing this and then thinking the name Original Sin, and if things changed, if we started off like this, and the event that brought us the moon, like, caused all that catastrophic whatever, I mean, we came a long way when you look at where we are now, but you could imagine how something like this, like, they start blaming people for what was going on in the heavens, like, this is your fault because of all your evil deeds or whatever. But that just gets into, you know, let's analyze things while we process the information, I guess. But just, I really want to, I'm going to get into the 7 days soon enough. He's talking about the 7 days here. He's actually referring to something that happened before the flood. So he's not saying that this was a reference to the 7 days of creation necessarily in what he was referring to here. But this is supposed to be a light that they remembered. But then there's that 12 suns shown that we saw in that other myth, or the tales from here, but it's coming up that same pattern where it's sometimes there's more, 7 or 8 and 12 suns shown before the deluge. Origins of words, just so everyone's clear. But yeah, we'll talk about that stuff later. And see, here he's saying Venus, this is why when you come up here and you read, he's saying he is referring this not as Venus, but specifically to the moon here. Because in terms of a lot of other things that's happening, Venus doesn't come in. Venus doesn't even enter till here. And I was trying to process going back and revisiting Velikovsky's work. I actually came across, see, Worlds in Collision, he was saying, was from Exodus on. But I kind of think Exodus itself is a time where we might have been, if we had to get from here somehow into here, then there had to be a transitionary period that hasn't really been talked about. And I think we might have been following behind during that. This might refer specifically to, like, say, the wandering in the desert or what, who knows. I'm not as good about mythology, and I don't necessarily care if it has to align, but you gotta wonder, because we were capable of doing all this before, but if something changed that, and then this is associated kind of like with the downfall of man. After this event, we're not able to do some of the things that we were once able to do. But just taking it from this point, coming back to the theory about Pangea Earth, and we had our orbit, we needed two potentials to explain the pole flip, which means if we come over here, we can consider one possible potential, 2, 3, 4, 5 different scenarios to place in either one of these situations. But there's actually something kind of fascinating he says when he's explaining this, that whatever took place since this event, nothing would have come close enough to the moon, or to the Earth, to rip the moon apart. But it always goes back to the earliest age. So here he's saying, no body more powerful than the Earth came sufficiently close to take the moon away from the Earth for good. Now you can actually apply that situation to this over here and the pole flip, like whichever one took hold of Earth and the moon had to be the more powerful of the two. So when we're looking at this equation over here in the solar system, you got to figure the Earth probably stole the moon from one of the smaller potentials. Or maybe the Earth originally orbited with one of the smaller potentials. But when they say the age of Uranus precedes Saturn, even if we were orbiting Saturn, if this was tidally locked, we would have never seen the sun prior to the event which brought us our moon, because that might have disturbed our orbit enough to where but before we ever saw this, we would have saw Uranus, if this was Uranus. It could have been Neptune. Who knows? It could have been another one of these, but I think at some point in time, when you factor it all in, the Earth stole the moon from something. Does it have to be Uranus? Not necessarily, but that would be interesting if some clues came up to link the moon with potentially some other celestial body. Earth has already had a few things that link it to Saturn, including the water. So if we find something that links maybe the moon to Uranus or Neptune, who knows? I don't know, just something to think about. Anyway, take care everyone. I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.